On the night of 26 in March 1883, in the new Vanderbilt Petit Chateau at 665th Avenue, New York, the air in the marble hall smelled of beeswax and cigar smoke. Reporters from the New York Times and World waited in the gallery, invited to witness what one called the ball of the century. At the top of the staircase, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt paused, lifting her arm so that the battery-wired torch in her electric light costume flared against the gas sconces. Her long kidskin glove creaked softly as she adjusted it, a hostess transformed into a literal beacon of power. Across the room, Alva Vanderbilt stood in her own worth gown, watching the photographers capture Alice's illuminated silhouette for posterity. The photographs would later sit in museum files, labeled in fine script, Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt as Electric Light, Vanderbilt Ball, March 26, 1883. In that flicker of artificial daylight, two sisters-in-law stepped into the same spotlight. Already calculating how not to share it, the evening glittered like triumph. It would cost them both far more than champagne. On 4 February 1867, in the Church of the Incarnation on Madison Avenue, New York, Alice Claypool Gwynn slipped on pale gloves before taking the hand of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, heir to the largest railroad fortune in America. The church was not one of the grand Fifth Avenue establishments where Knickerbocker families had married for generations, but it was respectable, and Alice herself brought impeccable credentials. Her family descended from colonial stock, her education had been proper if not ostentatious, her manner suggested the quiet dignity that old New York valued above flash. Parish records and later biographers describe her as serious, dutiful, sharing her husband's sense of responsibility to the family he was destined to lead. The rustle of silk mixed with organ music. Outside, carriage wheels ground over dirty snow that had turned gray with ash from coal stoves heating the surrounding brownstones. Cornelius was then 23, already working in his grandfather's railroad empire, already marked as the one who would carry forward Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt's ambitions after the old man's death. Alice, 21, understood that she was marrying not just a man but a position, a set of expectations about how the wife of the Vanderbilt heir should comfort herself. The gloves she wore that day, smooth kid leather, buttoned at the wrist with tiny pearl buttons, represented more than fashion. They were the uniform of her new role, always covered, always proper, always mindful that hands could reveal too much about work or worry or wanting. 8 years later, on 20th April 1875, at Calvary Church in New York, a different kind of bride took a different Vanderbilt hand. Alva Erskine Smith married Cornelius's younger brother, William Kissam Vanderbilt, in a ceremony that society pages covered with slightly less reverence than they had shown Alice's wedding. Alva brought beauty, wit, and determination, but her Alabama childhood had been marked by the financial instability that followed the Civil War. Her family's losses made her acutely conscious of money's presence and absence, and made her alert to the ways wealth could secure or destroy a woman's future. The match secured her financially, but placed her in a family still dismissed by the oldest New York families as new money. Railroad money, commercial money, money that smelled of coal smoke rather than inherited land. Portrait photographs from these early years, preserved in historical archives, show two young women with similar high collars and gloved hands, but different gazes. Alice looks directly at the camera with steady composure, her expression inward, suggesting someone accustomed to being observed, but comfortable maintaining privacy within that observation. Alva's gaze is also direct, but there is something challenging in it, alert and assessing, the look of someone who has learned to calculate odds and determine advantages. Both women are beautiful in the fashion of their era. Dark hair, clear skin, figures shaped by corseting into the ideal hourglass, but they wear their beauty differently. Alice wears hers like inheritance, something she was born possessing. Alva wears hers like armor, something she has learned to deploy strategically. From the beginning, marriage bound them to the same name, but not to the same expectations. Alice was expected to uphold an existing order, to be the gracious, uncontroversial wife of the heir, to entertain appropriately, but not ostentatiously, to bear children and raise them with proper values, to represent stability and continuity. Alva, married to the younger brother, occupied a more ambiguous position. She could not claim the senior rank that would eventually belong to Alice, but neither was she content to accept a permanently secondary role. The rivalry would not begin in words, which could be reported and criticized, but in stone and mortar and the careful choreography of social events. In all the ways that women with no direct access to power had learned to assert influence. By late 1882, the new Vanderbilt mansion at First West 57th Street rose over Fifth Avenue like a fortification, a massive 137-room brownstone palace where Alice and Cornelius Vanderbilt II presided with measured formality over a household that employed dozens of servants. The house itself made a statement about the Vanderbilt family's arrival at the pinnacle of American wealth. Cornelius's grandfather, the Commodore, had died in 1877, leaving the largest fortune in the United States, built on steamships and railroads, and now that fortune was being translated into the physical infrastructure of social power. Inside, the sound of footmen's steps on parquet floors was as controlled as the tone of Alice's calling cards, which she left at prescribed times according to rules that seemed unwritten but were as rigid as a law. Their daughter Gertrude Vanderbilt, born in 1875, would later recall in her own writings growing up amid strict routines, private tutors, and carefully managed summers at Newport, Rhode Island. The household ran with mechanical precision, meals at exact times, lessons according to schedule, social calls arranged days in advance. Alice oversaw this machinery with quiet efficiency, never raising her voice, never appearing flustered, maintaining the composure expected of someone in her position. Photographs from this period show her in dark, rich fabrics, velvets, and brocades, her hair arranged in the fashion of the day, her gloved hands resting in her lap or holding a book, every element of her appearance suggesting permanence and propriety. Across Fifth Avenue, in a sense both literal and metaphorical, Alva and William K. Vanderbilt were planning something different. They had engaged Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and now the most fashionable architect in New York, to design a house at 1660 Fifth Avenue. Hunt's architectural drawings, preserved in institutional archives, show a limestone chateau inspired by French Renaissance palaces, featuring elaborate carved facades, a grand staircase designed for dramatic entrances, and modern luxuries that went beyond mere comfort to become statements of technological sophistication, hydraulic elevators, advanced heating systems, electric lighting in some rooms, and most importantly, spaces specifically designed for entertaining on a scale that would dwarf anything New York society had yet seen. Alva oversaw every detail of the construction, working closely with Hunt to ensure that the house would achieve exactly the effect she intended. She reviewed drawings showing where guests would pause to remove their gloves in the entrance hall, how light would fall on the carved stone details, which rooms would be visible from the street, and which would remain mysterious until one entered. The house was not merely a residence, but a calculated instrument, designed to force society to acknowledge the Vanderbilts not as arrivistes, but as established powers with the taste and sophistication to rival European nobility. Society columns began to note a shift in how they referred to the two Mrs. Vanderbilts. The elder Mrs. Vanderbilt, or sometimes simply Mrs. Vanderbilt, denoted Alice, occupying the senior position by virtue of her husband's status as heir. The younger Mrs. Vanderbilt meant Alva, a designation that acknowledged both her position and her ambition. But increasingly, columnists noted distinctions not just of age or rank, but of style. The younger Mrs. Vanderbilt commissioning daring French architecture, hosting salons where she discussed art and politics, making herself conspicuous in ways that Alice never would. The Mrs. Vanderbilt at 57th Street maintaining sober grandeur, her entertainments impeccable but conventional, her presence felt through absence of scandal rather than through spectacle. The surname alone no longer distinguished status within New York society. Everyone knew who the Vanderbilts were. Now the houses themselves argued the case, each building advancing a different philosophy of what power should look like, how it should be displayed, what it should achieve for women without the vote, without legal rights to their husband's property, without direct access to political or economic power. Walls, staircases, and seating charts became instruments through which influence could be exerted and status contested. Architecture was not merely shelter, it was an argument made solid, ambition given permanent form. Alva's next move would prove decisive. The house at 660 Fifth Avenue was completed in early 1883, its limestone facade gleaming pale against the brownstone neighbors, its French Renaissance details immediately recognizable to anyone who had traveled in Europe or studied architectural books. But a house, however grand, required consecration through use. It needed an event that would force society to acknowledge not just the building, but the woman who had created it. The Vanderbilt Costume Ball of 26th West March 1883 became that event, carefully orchestrated over weeks of planning. Alva sent invitations to approximately 200 guests, an enormous number that would fill the house's public rooms to capacity and demonstrate the scale of entertaining the new architecture could accommodate. The costume requirement added an element of theater, transforming guests into performers in a spectacle that Alva directed with meticulous attention to detail. Most daringly, she invited photographers to set up a studio within the house itself, ensuring that the event would be documented not just in society columns, but in images that could be reproduced and distributed, making the ball legendary beyond those who actually attended. The real drama, however, lay in a more subtle calculation. Carolyn Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, maintained a famous list of the 400, those families considered socially acceptable, worthy of receiving invitations to her events. The Vanderbilts, despite their immense wealth, had not been fully admitted to this inner circle. Mrs. Astor's own daughter, Carrie, desperately wanted to attend the Vanderbilt ball. All of her friends were going, and the costume planning had become the chief topic of conversation for weeks. But Alva had not sent an invitation to the Astor household, and when Mrs. Astor's daughter inquired about this oversight, Alva's response was perfectly calibrated. She could not presume to send an invitation to someone whose mother had never paid a formal call on her, the call that etiquette required before invitations could be exchanged. The gambit worked. Rather than forego her daughter's attendance at the social event of the season, Caroline Astor submitted. She ordered her carriage, dressed in her formal calling attire, and paid the required visit to 660 Fifth Avenue, thereby acknowledging the Vanderbilts' position. Only then did the engraved invitation arrive for the Astor household. The incident, though never explicitly discussed in society columns, such explicit acknowledgement of power negotiations would have been vulgar, circulated through private conversations, and became part of New York social legend, the moment when the Vanderbilts were definitively admitted to the highest ranks. On that March evening, as 1,200 guests in elaborate costumes crowded into the new house, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt appeared in her electric light costume, designed by Charles Frederick Worth, the Parisian couturier who dressed European aristocracy and the most fashionable American women. The dress was a marvel of both artistry and engineering, its metallic embroidery reflecting light, its construction allowing for the integration of a small battery that powered the torch Alice carried. When she raised the torch, standing at the top of the grand staircase, she literally glowed in the gas-lit hall, a figure from mythology or allegory made real. Liberty, enlightenment, progress, all the concepts that wealthy Americans like to believe their fortunes represented. Alva, meanwhile, appeared as a Venetian princess, her costume also by Worth, dripping with historical detail and expensive fabrics. She moved through the rooms greeting guests, ensuring that every element of the evening proceeded according to plan, that the photographers captured the right moments, that the right people were seen in conversation with each other, that the entire event would be remembered as she intended. In the surviving photographs, now preserved in museum collections and historical archives, the two women occupy different roles in the same drama. Alice stands illuminated, arm raised, the visual centerpiece, transformed into a symbol of modernity and power. Alva appears in multiple images, always in motion, orchestrating, controlling, the architect of the entire spectacle. Two approaches to the same goal, one woman accepting the role of emblem, allowing herself to be transformed into a living representation of wealth and progress, the other claiming the role of creator, the one who designed the stage and directed the performance. That night, the sisters-in-law cooperated in a social coup that elevated them both. The ball definitively established the Vanderbilts as leaders of New York society, ending any question about whether railroad money could purchase social standing. But even in cooperation, the event quietly established that one woman would always be the architect, the strategist, the force that made things happen, while the other would be the emblem, the symbol, the beautiful figure that represented the family's arrival at respectability and power. Both roles were necessary. Neither was quite sufficient, and from that evening forward, the question would be which role held more actual power, which woman's influence would prove more enduring. On a cold morning in January 1886, at the Vanderbilt mansion on 57th Street, a governess corrected young Gertrude Vanderbilt's French conjugations in the upstairs schoolroom while a music master waited in an adjoining room, his violin case resting against a chair. Gertrude, then 10 years old, sat at a polished desk with excellent posture. She had been trained from early childhood to sit straight, shoulders back, chin level, working through exercises in a copybook. Later biographies and Gertrude's own reminiscences note that she received lessons from private tutors throughout her childhood, before eventually attending the Brearley School, one of New York's most exclusive academies for girls, where daughters of the oldest families studied alongside daughters of newer fortunes like the Vanderbilts. Alice insisted on a curriculum that emphasized not just academic subjects, but the countless small behaviors that distinguished young women of their class. How to enter a room, how to make proper introductions, how to write thank-you notes that struck the exact balance between warmth and formality, how to conduct conversation that was engaging without being controversial, how to move through social situations with grace that appeared effortless because the effort had been so thoroughly internalized, it had become invisible. In photographs from these years, Alice's daughters appear in elaborate silk dresses, their hair carefully arranged, wearing gloves even in garden settings where gloves served no practical purpose. Gloves mark them as girls being raised with certain expectations, certain standards, certain assumptions about the lives they would eventually lead. Across town, in the limestone chateau at 665th Avenue, Consuelo Vanderbilt, born 2nd March 1877 to Alva and William K. Vanderbilt, endured a more punishing regimen. In her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, published decades later in 1952, Consuelo recalled being forced by her mother to wear a steel rod apparatus designed to improve her posture, a device that ran along her spine and made slouching physically impossible. Her days were ruled by French and German lessons, music instruction, deportment drills that lasted hours, and constant surveillance by governesses who reported any lapse in behavior directly to Alva. "I do the thinking. You do as you're told," Consuelo later recalled her mother saying, a phrase that seemed to govern every aspect of her childhood. At writing tables in both households, young girls practiced thank-you notes on monogram paper, Vanderbilt, in elegant script at the top of each sheet, learning to craft sentences that conveyed gratitude without excessive emotion, warmth without intimacy, personality within rigid constraints of acceptable expression. Their gloves lay beside the inkwells like small white boundaries between flesh and ink, between interior feeling and exterior performance, between who they were and who they were being trained to become. The education these girls received was ostensibly preparation for life, but the curricula made brutally clear which lives were expected of them. They were not being trained to work, to support themselves, to make independent decisions about their futures. They were being trained to be ornamental, strategic, perfectly composed representatives of family wealth and status, to make marriages that would consolidate or elevate the family's position, to bear children who would carry forward the dynasty, to entertain appropriately, and above all, to appear to do all of this effortlessly, as if grace and beauty and perfect manners were their natural state rather than the product of years of relentless drilling and correction. The differences between Alice's approach and Alva's approach to raising daughters reflected the differences between the two women themselves. Alice emphasized stability, tradition, and understated elegance. Gertrude should learn to occupy her position with quiet dignity, should marry well within the established social circle, and should maintain rather than disrupt. Alva emphasized ambition, achievement, and spectacular display. Consuelo should be trained for the highest possible marriage, should be prepared to move in European aristocratic circles, and should be capable of conquering any social setting through a combination of beauty, accomplishment, and perfect technique. Both approaches shared the underlying assumption that daughters were assets to be developed and deployed strategically, that personal happiness was secondary to family advancement, that a girl's primary purpose was to enhance the family's social position through an advantageous marriage. In Newport, Rhode Island, where both families maintained summer residences, the final examinations of this training would play out in public view, with the daughters performing the roles their mothers had written for them, and society watching to judge whether the investment in education and discipline had produced the desired results. By August 1888, Newport had become the summer capital of American wealth, the place where the richest families escaped the heat and disease of cities to establish a parallel social season on the Rhode Island coast. Carriage wheels clicked along Bellevue Avenue past increasingly elaborate cottages, a term that had once meant modest summer houses but now described mansions of 30, 40, even 50 rooms, each with its own name, its own architectural ambition, its own claim to importance. Among these, the original breakers stood as the summer residence of Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt, a Queen Anne-style wooden structure with wide verandas overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. On those verandas, Alice received afternoon callers according to strict protocols that governed Newport's social life. Calling hours were precisely observed between 3 and 6 o'clock, with 15 minutes considered the proper length for a call unless specifically invited to stay longer. Ladies arrived in carriages. Servants helped them down. They were shown to the veranda or, in inclement weather, to the drawing room. Alice, always gloved, always impeccably dressed, extended her hand just so, not too eagerly, which would suggest desperation for company, but not too coolly, which would suggest unfriendliness. Her conversation was understated but decisive, her observations about mutual acquaintances carefully calibrated to convey information without obvious gossip, her opinions on art and literature reflecting good taste without controversial positions. Alva Vanderbilt, having frequented Newport since her girlhood, measured these wooden cottages against the European architecture she admired and found them wanting. She and William Kay had acquired property on Bellevue Avenue, and letters and architectural records preserved in various archives show her corresponding with Richard Morris Hunt about designs for a stone palace that would eclipse the existing structures. She spoke of wanting something that would stand for centuries, that would evoke the great houses of Europe, that would be built of marble rather than wood, permanent, imposing, impossible to ignore. Society columns chronicled the two Mrs. Vanderbilts attending the same dinners, the same races at the Newport Casino, the same church services at Trinity, the same charity events. But careful readers noticed that these columns rarely described them together, rarely placed them in the same sentence. Published photographs from Newport events show them at opposite ends of long tables, each surrounded by her own orbit of guests, each holding court in her own way. Alice through quiet authority and impeccable propriety, Alva through wit and increasingly ambitious entertaining. The division was spatial before it became explicitly dynastic, expressed through seating arrangements and calling patterns before it would be written in marble and stone. On Newport's manicured lawns, The real boundaries were not the hedges that separated one estate from another, or the fences that kept the public on designated paths. The real boundaries were invisible but precisely understood, where one woman's invitations ended and the other's began, which guests were loyal to Alice and which to Alva, which social events belonged to the senior Mrs. Vanderbilt's sphere of influence, and which to the youngers. Both women were building kingdoms, and kingdoms, by definition, have borders that must be defended. Marble would soon make those boundaries permanent, transforming social competition into architectural statements, rivalry into landscape, ambition into monuments that would outlast both women and continue arguing their cases long after their deaths. Construction on Marble House began in 1888 at 596 Bellevue Avenue, Newport, conceived as a birthday gift from William K. Vanderbilt to his wife Alva. The project would take 4 years and cost between $10 and $11 million. Estimates varied, but all agreed the sum was staggering even by Vanderbilt standards. The house would require some 500,000 cubic feet of marble, quarried specifically for this project and shipped to Newport, where craftsmen assembled it according to Richard Morris Hunt's designs. Architectural documents and correspondence preserved in various archives, including materials later donated to the Newport Preservation Society, show Alva working in close collaboration with Hunt, making decisions about everything from the placement of windows to the design of door handles, reviewing each element to ensure it met her vision. She referred to the house as a temple to the arts, and indeed its design evoked ancient Greek and Roman architecture filtered through French Renaissance sensibility, a classical vocabulary deployed to make an argument about permanence, culture, and refined taste. The Gold Room, perhaps the most spectacular of the interior spaces, dazzled with gilded wooden panels covering walls and ceiling, enormous mirrors multiplying the light from chandeliers, furniture upholstered in silk that matched the gold tones of the walls. The Gothic Room displayed medieval objects she had collected during European travels, creating a private museum within her home. Every room made a statement, every detail carried meaning, every surface had been considered and perfected. As workmen laid stone and craftsmen installed bronze balustrades and marble staircases, Alva walked through the unfinished halls, her gloves protecting her hands as fingertips brushed newel posts and tested the smooth coolness of marble walls. Later accounts suggest she visited the construction site regularly, inspecting progress, approving or rejecting work, making adjustments. This was not merely a house being built according to an architect's plans. This was Alva's vision being translated into 3 dimensions, her ambitions being given permanent form. In photographs taken after Marble House's completion, the building's classical facade appears almost stark against the Newport lawn, a deliberate contrast to the more ornate shingled neighbors, a statement that this was not a cottage in any sense but a palace, not temporary but eternal, not wood that would weather and require replacement, but marble that would stand for centuries. The house signaled that Newport was no longer merely a pleasant summer resort where wealthy families relaxed. It was an American Versailles, and Alva Vanderbilt meant to play more than a supporting role in its social dramas. For a woman who could not vote, who had no legal right to own property in her own name in many states, who could not hold public office or control her husband's business decisions, blueprint annotations and architectural specifications became a form of authorship, a way of writing herself into history through stone and metal and the careful arrangement of space. Marble House was Alva's book, her speech, her declaration of independence from the limitations that constrained women of her era. Across town, Alice Vanderbilt was watching, measuring, calculating her response. The answer, when it came, would be delivered in the same medium, architecture, that most public and permanent form of self-expression available to women who wielded influence but not direct power. By summer 1892, the first full season after Marble House's completion, guests stepping through its bronze doors entered a carefully choreographed experience designed to impress, educate, and subtly intimidate. The entrance hall, floored in marble, rose to a height that made even tall men feel diminished. The grand staircase, also marble, curved upward beneath a skylight that flooded the space with natural light. Contemporary accounts in society columns and private letters note the luncheons, music halls, and dinners where Alva controlled every detail, place cards written in her own hand ensuring that each guest sat exactly where she intended, table arrangements featuring flowers selected for their symbolic meaning and aesthetic impact, the order of dances at balls reflecting careful calculation about which young people should be encouraged to spend time together. Hostess manuals of the era, thick volumes preserved in historical libraries, advise that gloves should be removed only in precise circumstances, when eating, when playing certain card games, when preparing to play piano. At Marble House, photographs show Alva frequently greeting guests with bare hands, a subtle assertion that she made the rules rather than following them, that her house operated according to her preferences rather than established convention. Many of her female guests, however, kept their gloves on during much of their visits, the kid leather serving as both decoration and barrier, a beautiful constraint that marked them as guests rather than hostesses, followers rather than leaders. The soundscape of Marble House blended multiple registers: fountain spray from the terrace where water danced in Baroque patterns, the soft glide of satin trains across marble floors, the clink of crystal glasses and sterling silver cutlery, chamber music performed by hired musicians during dinners, and beneath it all, the particular acoustics of marble that amplified sound differently than wood, that made every footstep echo slightly, that reminded visitors constantly of the permanence and solidity of their surroundings. Newspapers praised the Stone Palace with its classical proportions and luxurious appointments, but they inevitably compared it to other Newport houses, and particularly to the Breakers, still in its earlier wooden incarnation. The comparisons were delicate, no direct criticism, which would have been vulgar, but adjectives weighed like jewels, descriptions that conveyed hierarchy through tone and emphasis. Grand versus intimate, imposing versus welcoming, palatial versus refined. Each word choice signaled which house the writer considered superior, which hostess had achieved the greater success in translating wealth into social authority. Etiquette at this level was less about kindness or consideration than about managing hierarchy without obvious cruelty. The goal was to make status distinctions clear while maintaining a surface of gracious hospitality, to ensure everyone understood their position while appearing to treat all guests with equal warmth. Alva excelled at this delicate balance, her entertainments demonstrating both generosity and power, her manner suggesting that she included you in her circle out of choice rather than obligation, that the invitation represented her favor rather than your right. Across town at the Breakers, Alice pursued a different strategy. She made guests feel that their inclusion reflected their own merit, their belonging to an established group of which she was merely the current custodian. Both approaches achieved social control. They simply approached it from different philosophical positions. On a cold November night in 1892, flames tore through the original Breakers, the wooden structure no match for fire that spread with terrifying speed through dry timber and fabric furnishings. Newport fire companies responded, but the combination of wooden construction and ocean winds made the blaze nearly impossible to control. By morning, the house was destroyed, leaving only charred framing and stone chimneys rising from the cliff above the Atlantic. Local newspapers recorded the event with straightforward factual reporting, noting that Alice and Cornelius Vanderbilt had been in their New York residence when the fire occurred, that no one had been injured, that the loss was estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but that the Vanderbilts would certainly rebuild. What those newspaper accounts could not capture was the opportunity the disaster created. What followed became part of Newport legend, a story told by tour guides decades later. Alice and Cornelius, faced with rebuilding, decided not to replace what had been lost but to construct something entirely new, something that would establish once and for all the senior branch's preeminence. They commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had designed Marble House for Alva, to create a new Breakers on the same oceanfront site. The resulting design drew inspiration from Italian Renaissance palazzos, particularly 16th century Genoese models, creating a massive structure that would contain approximately 70 rooms within 138,000 square feet of interior space. The facade facing the ocean featured a triple-arched loggia reminiscent of Mediterranean villas, suggesting a house built not for northern climates but for permanent sunshine, eternal summer. The interiors would incorporate materials imported from Europe: marble, alabaster, rare woods, gilded plasterwork, mosaics. The scale exceeded anything, yet built in Newport, larger than Marble House, more elaborate than any of the other cottages, impossible to ignore or diminish. Construction proceeded rapidly, driven by Cornelius's determination and nearly unlimited resources. Hunt worked with the same attention to detail he had brought to Marble House, but the budget and ambition for the breakers exceeded even that earlier project. When completed in 1895, the new breakers stood as the largest, most expensive private residence in Newport, its 70 rooms requiring a staff of dozens to maintain, its grandeur making clear that the senior Vanderbilt line would not be surpassed. In family photographs taken on the new terrace after completion, Alice's gloved hand rests lightly on the balustrade, her posture as perfect as always, her expression composed. But the gesture reads differently now. Not merely hospitality, but a kind of warning, a statement that this position, this view, this command of landscape and society belonged to her and would be defended. If Marble House was a temple, the New Breakers was a fortress, and Alice had claimed it as her throne. The fire had been a disaster, but disaster created opportunity. Alice had answered her sister-in-law in the only language their world truly respected: scale, permanence, the overwhelming physical presence of stone and marble arranged to impress and intimidate. The rivalry had moved from subtle social maneuvering to explicit architectural competition, from private positioning to public monuments. While houses expanded, however, another transformation was unfolding, one that would fracture the family structure that both houses were meant to glorify, and shift the balance of power between the two women in ways neither could have fully anticipated. In March 1895, newspapers throughout New York and beyond reported what many considered shocking news. A New York court had granted Alva Vanderbilt a divorce from William K. Vanderbilt on grounds of adultery. The proceedings had been conducted with as much discretion as such matters could achieve, but the outcome was public record. The settlement, as various sources reported, left Alva with Marble House, substantial financial resources, and a degree of independence nearly unprecedented for a woman of her social position. Divorce among families of their rank was not unheard of. By the 1890s, the absolute prohibition was weakening, but it remained scandalous, a mark against one's reputation that could result in social exclusion. Later biographies quote Alva's own retrospective assessment, delivered with characteristic confidence. "I always do everything first. I blaze the trail for the rest to walk in." She was referring both to her marriage into the Vanderbilt family despite her family's reduced circumstances, and to her willingness to leave that marriage when it no longer served her purposes. The phrase captures something essential about Alva's approach to life. She saw herself as pioneer rather than follower, innovator rather than conformist, someone who created precedents rather than observing them. Society pages alternated between shock and fascination. Some columnists wrote admiringly of her courage in leaving an unhappy marriage, praising her independence and strength. Others expressed disapproval, suggesting that divorce reflected poorly on her character and would damage her social standing. The coverage itself revealed the tensions within Gilded Age society about women's roles, marriage, and the extent to which wealth could insulate someone from conventional moral judgments. Within the Vanderbilt family, the reactions went largely unrecorded in public documents. Families of their rank did not air internal disputes in newspapers or through public statements. But later family histories and biographical accounts suggest a cooling of relations between branches of the family. Alice, as matriarch of the senior line and wife of Cornelius until his death in 1899, upheld a more traditional ideal of marital endurance. In portraits from the mid-1890s, she appears in dark gowns of silk or velvet, her gloves neatly buttoned at the wrist, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting someone who had accepted certain burdens and would carry them with dignity regardless of personal cost. The divorce marked a turning point in how the two women were perceived and how they perceived each other. Alva had claimed a kind of freedom that Alice, whether from conviction or circumstance, would never seek. That freedom came at a price. Alva's place within the tight inner ring of the family was diminished, her social position now complicated by being a divorced woman rather than a married one. But it was a price she appeared willing to pay, even eager to pay, if it meant escaping a marriage that had become intolerable and claiming the right to direct her own life. Her next move would demonstrate that she intended to use that freedom to achieve something she had pursued throughout her adult life, a connection to European aristocracy that would elevate the family name beyond the limitations of American new money. On 6 November 1895, at St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue in New York, Consuelo Vanderbilt married Charles Spencer Churchill, the ninth Duke of Marlborough, in what newspapers called the social event of the decade. Press coverage celebrated the union as a romantic alliance between American wealth and English nobility, the kind of transatlantic marriage that had become increasingly common as indebted British aristocrats sought American heiresses and ambitious American families sought titles that would grant them status no amount of money alone could purchase. Estimates of Consuelo's dowry, reported in various newspapers and later confirmed by historical research into the marriage settlement, ranged as high as $2.5 million in railroad stock with additional annual income, sums essential to maintaining Blenheim Palace, the massive Baroque structure that was the Marlborough seat and one of England's most significant architectural monuments. The wedding appeared to validate everything Alva had worked toward, her daughter married to a duke, the Vanderbilt name now connected to British aristocracy. The family's social position elevated beyond question, but Consuelo's own account, published decades later in her 1952 memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, gave a starkly different perspective on the event. "I spent the morning of my wedding in tears and alone," she wrote, describing how she had been forced into the marriage despite being in love with another man, how guards had been placed at her bedroom door to prevent her escape, how her mother had pressured her relentlessly until resistance became impossible. The steel rod Alva had forced her to wear as a child to improve her posture had become, in metaphorical terms, the rigid structure of a marriage contract that allowed no deviation from the course her mother had planned. In Newport that summer before the wedding, both Marble House and the newly completed Breakers had hosted dinners and gatherings related to the match. Each matron presented herself as connected to this triumph, Alva as the architect of the alliance, the mother who had raised a daughter capable of winning a duke, Alice as the aunt who had helped provide the family context and social foundation that made such a match possible. Guests moved between the two houses, aware that loyalties were being silently tallied, that each woman was claiming credit for an outcome that reflected well on the entire Vanderbilt family. The wedding photographs show Consuelo in an elaborate gown, her face beautiful but expressionless, her bearing perfect but somehow lifeless, the product of training so thorough that she could perform flawlessly, even in circumstances of profound personal distress. For Alva, the marriage justified every lesson in discipline, every hour of deportment training, every sacrifice of personal preference to family ambition. It proved that her methods worked, that the investment in rigorous education and social positioning had paid dividends in the form of a Duchess daughter. For Alice, watching from her position as senior family matron, the marriage exemplified the dangers of ambition outrunning affection, of treating children as instruments of social strategy rather than as individuals deserving of consideration and care. For Consuelo herself, it recorded forever the cost of obedience, the price paid by young women raised to believe that their duty to family superseded their right to personal happiness. On 11 January 1896, Barely 2 months after orchestrating her daughter's wedding to the Duke of Marlborough, Alva, now divorced from William K. Vanderbilt, married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont at his New York residence. Belmont came from a wealthy and socially prominent family, his fortune based on banking rather than railroads. His social position secure enough that marrying a divorced woman, while raising eyebrows, did not threaten his standing. With this marriage, Alva became Alva Belmont, a new identity that marked her further departure from the Vanderbilt orbit, while maintaining her access to wealth and social resources. She moved into Belcourt, Belmont's Newport estate, a house designed by Richard Morris Hunt. Inevitably, and known for its elaborate stables and ground-floor carriage rooms, Belmont was passionate about horses and had built a house that reflected that passion. The marriage aligned her with another wealthy family while allowing her to retain control of Marble House, which remained hers by the terms of her divorce settlement. She now possessed two significant Newport properties, a rare circumstance for a woman, and the independence to use them as she saw fit. With this second marriage, she stepped further from the Vanderbilt family's direct sphere of influence, yet remained a towering figure in Newport and New York society. Someone whose invitations still mattered, whose opinions carried weight, whose presence at an event signaled its importance. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died on 12th of September 1899, at only 55 years old, Alice became the widow of the family's senior line, the dowager matron whose position was now defined by her late husband's rank and her own decades of careful cultivation of social relationships. Biographical accounts describe her as increasingly reserved, but firmly in command of the breakers and the family's Fifth Avenue mansion, maintaining both establishments with the same meticulous attention to detail she had always demonstrated. A later description would call her Queen of New York society, a title earned through decades of disciplined hosting, charitable work, and the careful management of her public image. Never controversial, never scandalous, always representing stability and continuity in a world that was changing with increasing speed. In photographs from the early 1900s preserved in various archives and family collections, the difference between the two women becomes visually apparent. Alva sits forward in chairs, her posture suggesting engagement and energy, her gloved hands often captured in motion, as she gestures while speaking at meetings or social gatherings. Alice sits back slightly in more formal poses, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her posture suggesting someone presiding rather than campaigning, observing rather than agitating. Both women continued to wield significant influence, but they did so through different means and toward different ends. Their rivalry had shifted from overt architectural competition. Both women now possessed the grandest houses in Newport, making further one-upmanship through building impractical, to divergent philosophies about how a woman of their station should wield influence. Alva increasingly turned her formidable organizational skills and financial resources toward political activism, particularly the cause of women's suffrage. Alice focused on maintaining her position as guardian of social standards, the person who could open or close doors for younger families seeking acceptance, the arbiter of what was and was not acceptable among New York's elite. Both women survived widowhood by turning their roles outward rather than retreating into private grief, but they pointed their influence in opposite directions, one toward reform and change, the other toward preservation of a social order that was already beginning its slow dissolution. By autumn 1909, Marble House had become something its architect and original purpose never anticipated, a headquarters for political activism. Alva Belmont, now 66 years old and widowed again after Oliver Belmont's death in 1908, had become one of the leading financial supporters and organizers of the women's suffrage movement. She hosted the first of what would become known as the Marble House Conferences in Newport, where suffragists from across the country gathered to debate strategy, coordinate campaigns, and plan the political work that would eventually lead to the 19th Amendment granting women the vote in 1920. The same gold room where society matrons had once competed over the elegance of their gowns now echoed with speeches about political rights and constitutional amendments. The terrace where guests had taken tea while admiring the ocean view became the setting for suffrage rallies where women held banners and made public statements that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. Archival records and museum collections preserve Alva's famous custom china service, emblazoned with the slogan "Votes for Women" in blue script across white porcelain, teacups, saucers, plates all carrying this message, transforming the ritual of afternoon tea from social nicety into political statement. In photographs from these suffrage gatherings, guests sit at long tables in the Gold Room, their white-gloved hands resting beside cups bearing that radical slogan. The contrast is striking. The most opulent setting in Newport, a house that had been built to demonstrate wealth and taste and social dominance, now serving as the venue for discussions about political equality and democratic rights. The same woman who had forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge the Vanderbilts through careful social maneuvering was now using similar strategic skills to advance a cause that threatened the very social structures she had once worked so hard to penetrate and dominate. Alva's transformation from social climber to suffragist patron is well documented in her speeches, preserved correspondence, and the institutional records of suffrage organizations she supported financially. Yet the methods remained remarkably consistent with her earlier efforts. She controlled guest lists carefully, ensuring the right mix of publicity and respectability. She deployed visual symbolism strategically, understanding that the contrast between Marble House's luxury and the suffragists' serious political purpose would generate press coverage. She staged events with the same attention to detail she had once brought to costume balls, only now the costumes were suffrage white, and the audience was the American public rather than just New York society. The architecture she had built to force acceptance into an exclusive world now served to open doors for others, specifically for women seeking basic political rights. Marble, that most permanent of materials, carried an argument that transcended personal prestige. It demonstrated that the fight for women's rights had supporters among the wealthiest and most socially prominent Americans, that this was not merely a movement of radicals, but included women who understood power and how to wield it effectively. While Alva courted headlines for reform, hosting suffrage conferences and funding political campaigns, Alice Vanderbilt maintained her quieter kingdom in a house that would outlast them both, presiding over a social order whose dissolution she could sense but could not prevent. In the 1920s, visitors to the Breakers still found Alice Vanderbilt presiding over summer rituals that seemed increasingly anachronistic in the post-World War I era. The war had transformed American society, accelerating changes that had been developing for decades. Women had gained the vote in 1920. Younger generations were rejecting the formality of their parents' world. New fortunes from different industries were challenging the dominance of railroad and banking wealth. Yet at the Breakers, Alice maintained the old patterns: teas on the loggia overlooking the Atlantic, musicals in the Great Hall where hired performers played for guests seated in gilt chairs, charity events benefiting hospitals and churches that her family had supported for decades. Biographical notes and society pieces from this period describe her as a dowager matron, and in some accounts, Queen of New York society, though by now she shared that unofficial title with others, and younger hostesses were emerging to challenge the old guard's dominance. She was in her 70s, having outlived her husband by more than 2 decades, having raised children to adulthood and seen them make their own choices about marriage and social position. The house itself had begun to feel less like a private residence and more like a museum of a fading social order. The servants were harder to find and train. The costs of maintaining 70 rooms had become burdensome, even for the Vanderbilt fortune, and fewer families could sustain the level of entertaining that had once defined Newport summers. After Alice's death on 22nd of April 1934, at her Manhattan residence, she was 89 years old and had maintained her New York and Newport establishments until the end. The family faced the practical question of what to do with the Breakers. The house was too large for modern family life, too expensive to maintain without the social reason that had justified its construction. Eventually, the family leased and then sold the property to the Preservation Society of Newport County, an organization dedicated to preserving Newport's architectural heritage and opening historic houses to public tours. In 1948, The breakers open to tourists who now follow routes mapped in guidebooks, their footsteps echoing through spaces where servants once moved silently, where Alice once received guests with perfect grace, where the machinery of Gilded Age social power had once operated at its highest efficiency. Visitors today see the grand hall with its soaring ceiling and marble columns, the music room with its gilded panels, the morning room with its platinum leaf ceiling, and the dining room that could seat 34 guests. They see photograph displays showing Alice in various stages of her life, including the famous image of her in the electric light costume from the 1883 ball, her arm raised, torch glowing, glove smooth against her wrist. They read labels explaining the house's history, the Vanderbilt family's rise to prominence, the social customs and expectations of the Gilded Age. What they cannot see is the constant effort required to maintain the performance, the pressure of always being observed, the cost of living as a symbol rather than simply as a person. In nearby museum displays, curators have placed Alva's Votes for Women china alongside information about her suffrage activism. The teacups and saucers that once seemed radical are now carefully cataloged as historic objects, their political message transformed from urgent demand into preserved artifacts. Marble House, too, is now a museum. Opened to the public in 1963, its Gold Room and Gothic Room interpreted through guided tours that explain the architecture, the collections, and the history of the family that built it. What had been rivalry between two women now reads, at historical distance, as two adjacent experiments in female power within the rigid constraints of Gilded Age society, one rooted in continuity and tradition, maintaining established social structures while occupying the position of queen within them, the other rooted in disruption and change, challenging those structures even while benefiting from them. Both approaches emerged from the same fundamental reality. Women of their class and generation had no direct access to political or economic power, no ability to vote or hold office or control businesses, yet possessed resources and social position that could be leveraged toward various ends. The gloves both women wore throughout their lives, at balls and teas, at dinners and charity events, at weddings and funerals, were simultaneously decoration, requirement, and symbol. They marked their wearers as ladies of a certain class, protected their hands from the appearance of labor, and maintained the boundary between private flesh and public performance. In avant display cases now, those gloves lie motionless behind glass, their kid leather preserved through careful conservation, their silence raising questions their wearers rarely voiced aloud about the costs and constraints of privilege, about what it meant to wield influence without power, to perform grace under constant scrutiny, to shape the world through the limited means available to women who could own great houses but not fully control their own destinies.